With General Smith now in command of 9th Army Corps and General Puller assuming command of the 1st Marine Division, General Ridgway decided it was time for a counteroffensive to be spearheaded by the Marines. Phase 1 of the plan was Operation Killer, an 8-day UN offensive that concluded February 28th and pushed Communist forces north of the Han River. Ridgway was dissatisfied with the results of Killer. While the operation had attained its terrain objectives and interrupted the Chinese Communist plans for an immediate major offensive, it had not caused anywhere near the amount of enemy casualties Ridgway had desired. Ground taken today can be lost tomorrow, but an enemy soldier killed today has no hope of fighting tomorrow. Ridgway wanted blood, not land. With the evidence that the Chinese were still attempting to conserve their forces and set themselves for another massive attack, Ridgway resolved to continue his own drive to the north, beating the enemy to the punch. The second phase, Operation Ripper, was intended to destroy as much of the Chinese Communist People's Volunteer Army and North Korean military around Seoul and the towns of Hongcheon-gun and Choncheon as possible. The operation also aimed to bring UN troops to the 38th parallel. Ripper began with the largest artillery bombardment of the Korean War. On a cold, clear morning that quickly gave way to clouds and snow, the 1st Marine Division went into the attack with the 7th Marines Regiment on the left and the 1st Marines Regiment on the right. As in the early stages of Operation Killer, Chinese resistance was light, confining itself to scattered small arms fire from the enemy's line of outposts. By nightfall, the day's objectives had been secured at a total cost of 7 Marines wounded. The suspicions of the first day that things were going too well were confirmed on the second. The Chinese were continuing the withdrawal they had commenced the previous month, carefully picking their fights and giving battle only to cover the withdrawals of other units. They were falling back, but they were doing it very skillfully and under control. When it was required, they were ready to put up a blistering fight in one area in order to let units withdraw from an adjacent piece of ground. Chinese resistance continued to be light and sporadic on the following day, but not so light that Charlie Company 1-1 didn't run into a lethal hornet's nest on one of the mangled ridges before Umsan. Darkness fell with Charlie Company in uncontested possession of the ridge. As they had done so often, the Chinese turned and pulled out. Throughout the next 2 days, Marine units devoted themselves to local patrolling, while friendly units on the right that had been outpaced by the Marine advance caught up. Then, early on March 11th, it was back to business. Faced with thousands of determined Marines, the Chinese continued to give ground and fall back to the north. Pressing forward for the next 3 days, the 1st Marine Division was well established on Operation Ripper's first major objective, Phase Line Albany. On the following day, friendly units to the west found the ravaged city of Seoul abandoned by the backpedaling enemy. During the night of March 14th and 15th, elements of the South Korean 1st Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Division liberated Seoul, marking the 4th and last time the capital would have changed hands since June 1950. Scarcely pausing to catch its breath on Phase Line Albany, the 1st Marines jumped off toward Hongcheon and Phase Line Buffalo early on the morning of March 15th. Utilizing the rugged, muddy terrain to maximum advantage, the Communists conducted a skillful and bloody delaying action. The area was almost devoid of roads. The few that did exist were little more than ox cart trails. Dominating the whole operational area was the 2,900-foot mountain the Koreans called Omsan. For the defender, the area was a natural stronghold. For the attacker, it was a truly nasty place. If the difficulties posed by the terrain weren't bad enough, the weather, which had been so foul throughout Operation Killer, showed no signs of improving. Corporal Austin Stack, a machine gunner in Baker Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, remembered the period as the time of his lowest morale in Korea. Being constantly cold and wet, pelted by rain, freezing rain, sleet and snow, and slogging wearily through a mixture of half-frozen, boot-top deep snow, mud and slush, can dim the spirits of the most cheerful optimist and give pause to even the most determined masochist. Despite these obstacles, Operation Ripper pressed on throughout March. By one means or another, the advance kept moving. Evidence that it was disrupting Chinese plans for a fighting withdrawal came in the form of an intercepted radio communication early on March 15th. "We cannot fight any longer. We must move back today. We will move back at 1400. Enemy troops will enter our position at 1300 or 1400. Enemy troops approaching fast." Late that afternoon, the lead elements of Major Webb D. Sawyer's 1st Marine Division, 7th Regiment, entered Hongchon without a fight. It was a different story north of Hongchon, where for the next 3 days, the Chinese fought bitterly, battling for every lump and bump in the ground. The 1st Marines on the right had their hands full with Chinese fighting from a succession of skillfully sited bunkers and trenches. In a series of bloody hand-to-hand encounters, up close and personal, Marines had to shoot, blast, and burn the defenders from their strongholds. On the infrequent occasions when the weather lifted, the treetop level strikes of Marine close air support provided the element that turned the tables. The 1st Marine Division's running gun battles with the Chinese continued to follow the pattern of alternately fighting and withdrawing. Slowly but surely, however, the Chinese were being forced backward until on March 20th, the advance had reached Phase Line Buffalo. Before darkness fell, the 5th Marines, with the 1st Marines on the right, and aided by deadly accurate airstrikes by Marine fighter squadrons, overran the Chinese main line of resistance. Battling pocket after pocket of resistance in a continuing rattle and crash of point-blank fire, punctuated by the detonation of grenades and mortar rounds, they moved on. Supplied by airdrops and ably supported by Lieutenant Colonel William McReynolds' 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, firing in direct support, they slugged their way forward until the issue was decided. Hongchon was taken on the 15th and Chungcheon secured on the 22nd. All the objectives of Operation Ripper were now controlled by the 8th Army, which had been attacking continuously since February 21st. Still, with evidence mounting that the CCF had not abandoned plans for a major offensive, General Ridgway wanted to find a way to keep the pressure on. MacArthur now had a clear victory, and he wanted to destroy the bridges over the Yalu to prevent the CCF from bringing more troops and supplies into Korea. To accomplish that, he would now have to battle the President of the United States. During the Korean War's opening months, General Douglas MacArthur had enjoyed unparalleled success on the battlefield. Not only did he rally UN forces and stave off their total collapse, but he led his soldiers in the near annihilation of the North Korean army. That winter, MacArthur watched as Chinese soldiers drove his men back beyond the 38th parallel, virtually erasing all progress UN forces had made during the previous months. Once again on the offensive, General MacArthur campaigned for broadening escalation of the war.
Seeing his men being annihilated and being driven back to the 38th parallel and beyond, he immediately started to suggest that maybe we ought to invade Manchuria, we ought to invade China, and this is where he and President Truman are going to run into a problem.
President Truman, along with members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and State Department, doubted MacArthur's ability to comprehend the United States' ever-changing national policy. While the United States was committed to fighting the spread of communism, many believed that the battle would be won in Europe, not Asia. American policymakers were hesitant to meet MacArthur's request for additional reinforcements because it meant limiting their military buildup in Europe. There was also the threat of full-scale nuclear war if Russia would come to the aid of the Asian communists with their full military force. With the United States still recovering from World War II, President Truman was wary of sparking another worldwide conflict, even if it meant accepting stalemate in Korea.
President Truman wasn't the only one. I mean, one of his good buddies was General Omar Bradley, and Omar Bradley told Doug, he said, "Doug, if we invade China, it's going to be the wrong war at the wrong time and the wrong place, and definitely it's the wrong enemy, because in the eyes of most of our Joint Chiefs and most of our great military men, the real problem in the world was more in Europe than it was, and certainly in Asia. And they thought this would be the wrong thing to do. This could end up bringing in not only China, but certainly the Soviet Union could come in and we could have a real disaster on our hands."
Despite these warnings, General MacArthur continued to campaign for an invasion of Manchuria.
He felt very strongly that if we're going to fight a war, we have to fight a war for victory. And he was determined that, by God, we're going to win. I'm a soldier. I don't sit around and fight. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a negotiator. I don't deal with the UN. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in winning this war. You put me in command, I'm going to win, and this is what I need to win.
On December 29th, General MacArthur received a new directive that radically altered his objectives in Korea. Instead of winning the war at all costs, MacArthur was ordered to restore international peace and security. He would defend in successive positions, inflicting such damage to hostile forces in Korea as possible, subject to his primary consideration of the safety of his troops. The message concluded by saying that the UN forces would no longer be seeking a decisive victory in Korea. Unsatisfied with his new mission objectives, General MacArthur replied with a strategy of his own. MacArthur believed that when China crossed the Yellow River on North Korea's behalf, they initiated a new war that must be dealt with accordingly. General MacArthur's plan called for a complete economic blockade of China. Unfortunately for General MacArthur, President Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff did not agree. 2 days later, on December 31st, 1950, Chinese forces swept across the 38th parallel and captured Seoul. Once again, UN forces were in retreat. Even though Seoul was quickly recaptured by 8th Army and ROK forces, President Truman began considering the possibility of a negotiated settlement. The People's Republic of China had demonstrated that they were willing to defend North Korea at all costs, and the UN was equally determined to protect the South counterpart. President Truman now believed that a peaceful resolution offered the best chance of avoiding an escalation in fighting. General MacArthur did not share his commander-in-chief's opinions and became increasingly outspoken against Truman's administration in the following months.
Truman gave him every opportunity to basically follow orders and follow instructions, but insubordination was something that MacArthur was independent. He liked to be independent. He didn't want to have, even though he knew the military protocol and who he reported to, he was still independent. And he disagreed violently with Truman. He disagreed with other military people who told him that this was not the right thing to do.
On December 6, 1950, President Truman had issued a memo stating that no speech, press release, or other public statement concerning military policy should be released until it has received clearance from the Department of Defense. Disregarding the president's wishes, General MacArthur issued a public statement on March 24, 1951, designed to garner support for his proposed invasion of China. In this statement, General MacArthur said that China would undoubtedly collapse if the United States invaded their country. Furthermore, he overstepped his authority by offering to open negotiations with the Chinese. When President Truman heard about the general's statement, he was furious. With his command already in jeopardy, General MacArthur agreed to show greater restraint in the future.
He agreed in early April that he would not say anything anymore after Truman had given him his final warning. But then he sent a message to a congressman in Massachusetts who read it on the air at that time in radio mostly, in which he criticized the president.
On March 20th, General MacArthur had written a letter to the Republican minority leader in the House of Representatives, Congressman Joseph W. Martin, Jr. In this letter, General MacArthur agreed with Martin's assessment that Chinese nationalists should be deployed in Korea. The letter ended with a criticism of Truman's administration that would ultimately cost MacArthur his career. It seems strangely difficult for some to realize that here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest, and that we have joined the issue thus raised on the battlefield, that we have joined the issue thus while the diplomats there still fight it with words, that if we lose the war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe is inevitable. Win it, and Europe most probably would avoid war and yet preserve freedom. As you point out, we must win. There is no substitute for victory. On April 5th, Congressman Martin presented MacArthur's letter to Congress, and it was recorded in the Congressional Record.
That's when the president had no other option but to fire him.
On April 11th, 1951, like a thunderclap, came the news that President Harry S. Truman had relieved General of the Army Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Korea.
And that firing is going to cause some political problems. Now, the military, there are going to be people in the military who would support MacArthur, but many of the people who were there, many of the people who were the higher up, understood exactly what the president was doing. He had insubordination.
MacArthur's firing also upset many prominent members of the political community.
There were a lot of people in politics who believed that Truman was wrong. Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, who was certainly made his name famous after that, got up in front of Congress and called Harry Truman a son of a bitch, just as big as you please, right out on the floor. A senator from Indiana said that the higher up in our Oval Office in the White House is being run by a bunch of communist sympathizers. And, you know, people were saying things that today we look back and say, did they really say that? Yeah, they did. But we seem to forget that today, if you criticize anybody in the government, immediately it's going to be a problem for some people. But there were certainly a lot of feelings, bad feelings about Truman.
MacArthur was hosting a luncheon at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo when he first heard about his dismissal. Colonel Sidney Huff, serving as MacArthur's aide, heard the news on a Japanese radio station and informed his commander. General MacArthur took the news calmly and started making preparations to relinquish his command. When Douglas MacArthur arrived in San Francisco, It marked the first time in 14 years that the general had set foot on American soil. Large crowds gathered in the city to give MacArthur a hero's welcome. Parades were held in San Francisco, New York, and Washington to thank the old general for nearly 50 years of dedicated military service. On April 19, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur addressed Congress for the last time. In what would be remembered as one of his greatest speeches, MacArthur defended his actions in Korea before offering his final farewell.
The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
General Matthew Ridgway was appointed as MacArthur's successor. Although he was similar to MacArthur in many regards, Ridgway understood that the perception of war had changed since 1945.
Matthew Ridgway was well respected, who took over for MacArthur, was a man who basically was going to be a pure soldier in following orders, and was understood that if he was going to be MacArthur's successor, he would do what was necessary in order to solve this particular problem.
Command of the 8th Army was assumed by Lieutenant General James A. Van Fleet, a thorough professional with a reputation as a vigorous commander who preferred offensive combat. He arrived on the scene as more and more evidence was mounting that the Chinese Communist forces were on the verge of launching the major countrywide offensive that had long been anticipated. Operations Killer and Ripper had set the Chinese back on their heels and taken a good bite out of their hide. But while these twin operations had delayed the Chinese, they were unable to cripple them sufficiently to prevent them from going over to the attack. On the night of April 22nd, 23rd, that attack began. Called the Fifth Phase Offensive by the Chinese, an assault force of 4 armies with a total strength of nearly 125,000 men slammed into the UN lines. Supported by massed artillery fire, the brunt of the attack fell on the Republic of Korea Army's 6th Division, in position on the left of the 1st Marine Division. The 6th Division was inundated, opening a huge rupture in the friendly lines through which the Chinese sent thousands of reinforcements. During the night attack, General Chesty Puller had posted the 1st Marine Division in the Iron Triangle, about 30 miles north of the 38th parallel. The CCF caromed off the left flank of the Marines and shattered the 6th Rock Division. By daylight, the CCF had driven 10 miles deep and 10 miles wide into the UN lines, but the Marines had not budged an inch. With other elements of the 9th Corps in jeopardy, General Smith ordered Puller to pull back to the main line. Puller fought a vicious withdrawal, saving several 9th Corps units from total destruction. It was the beginning of fighting on a scale and intensity not seen by Marines since the Chosin Reservoir campaign. General Van Fleet saw an opportunity in the situation. He would trade space for Chinese bodies. Bit by bit, the 8th Army would fall back, always in good order, and inflicting maximum casualties on the attackers. Like Ridgway before him, Van Fleet had no interest in real estate. He was going to make the Chinese pay, and pay dearly, for every yard of ground gained. It was a combination of maneuver warfare and attrition warfare, with friendly forces stepping back little by little, all the while placing devastating fires of air, infantry, and artillery on the wave upon wave of attackers thrown at them. The Chinese were gaining some ground, but their forces were being chewed up in wholesale lots. Undeterred, the Chinese poured follow-on units into the battle. They may as well have been feeding men into a meat grinder. By mid-May, the Chinese attack had slowed to a crawl as the bodies of Chinese soldiers piled up in heaps and CCF supplies dwindled to a trickle. Van Fleet lost no time in going over to the offensive himself. In a series of slashing attacks throughout late May and early June, Allied forces thoroughly pummeled the decimated Chinese forces that were now falling back in complete disorder, seeking only to escape the killing ground. Advancing deeper into North Korea than it had been when the CCF offensive started, the 1st Marine Division gave the fleeing enemy no respite. It was a slaughter. When it was all over in late June, the CCF had been bled white. The vaunted 5th Phase offensive had been a catastrophic failure that left the CCF High Command stunned by its magnitude. Only the mountainous Korean terrain, which prevented General Van Fleet from launching an armored breakthrough, saved the CCF from complete destruction. As the first year of the Korean War ended, the 1st Marines of the 1st Marine Division, who had fought continuously for 60 days, could take satisfaction from the knowledge that they had proven themselves worthy of standing beside the Marines of Belleau Wood, Iwo Jima, and the Chosin Reservoir. Many of them would have settled for a hot shower.